The macabre history of the Blackwood Brothers Curse in the Appalachian Mountains, 1887. Before we get into this terrifying story, drop a comment telling me your location and the time right now. I love knowing who's out there with me in the darkness, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button so you never miss a story like this one. The morning of October 3rd, 1887, broke gray and cold over the ridgeline of eastern Tennessee's Appalachian Mountains. Overnight, a thin frost had crept across the fallen leaves, leaving every root and stone coated in a pale, brittle film that crunched under the boots of three men as they made their way toward the trailhead at the edge of Harlan County. They were the Blackwood Brothers, and in those parts, that name carried weight. Elias Blackwood, the eldest at 34, rode at the front of the small column, his broad shoulders squared against the morning chill, his jaw set with that particular confidence worn only by a man who has never been told no. He had taken over the family timber operation 3 years earlier after their father, Josiah Blackwood, died from a fever the local doctor called unusual and the local preacher called deserved. Elias dismissed both opinions and threw himself into expanding the Blackwood holdings with ruthless efficiency. Riding behind him was Corvin, 29, lean and dark-eyed, a brother known for keeping ledgers and carrying grudges in equal measure. Where Elias acted, Corvin calculated. He was the one who had identified the stretch of Appalachian woodland they were now riding toward, a dense, untouched tract of old growth timber that on paper belonged to no one. In practice, as the men of the region well knew, it belonged to the mountain itself. Bringing up the rear, leading the pack mule by a rope, walked Seth, 22, the youngest. He was different from his brothers in ways difficult to name precisely. His eyes moved too much, noticed too much. He had their father's dark brow and their mother's nervous hands, and he had never quite lost the habit of looking over his shoulder on the trail, even in broad daylight. "Seth, keep up," Elias called back without turning his head. "We lose the light by 4:00 up here. I want to reach the North Ridge before noon." Seth tugged at the mule's rope and said nothing. 3 miles behind them now lay the town of Cutter's Creek, a scattering of clapboard storefronts, a post office, a church with a sagging steeple, and a saloon that did more business than all others combined. It was in that saloon the previous evening that an old man named Hector Crow had approached their table. Crow was perhaps 70, though he had the look of someone who had lived several lives' worth of hard years. His face was a map of deep lines, and his eyes were the pale, washed-out gray of a winter sky. Without being invited, he set his weathered hat on the table and lowered himself into an empty chair. "You boys are the Blackwoods," he said. "It was not a question. We are," said Elias flatly, not looking up from his map. "And you're not invited to sit." Crow ignored this. "I know which trail you're taking tomorrow. I know which land you're going to survey." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm asking you, as a man who has lived long enough to know what asking costs, not to go up that trail after sundown, not a Blackwood, not with that name." Corvin laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Old man, half this county has a story about those woods. Haunted this, cursed that. We've heard every version. You haven't heard the true one," Crow said quietly. Elias finally looked up. "Is that a threat?" Crow met his gaze without flinching. "It's a fact. The stones up there have a long memory, Mr. Blackwood, and your family's debt to those stones is older than you know." He rose, retrieved his hat, and walked back to the bar without another word. Elias folded the map deliberately and called for another whiskey. Now in the cold, pale morning, with the tree line closing in around them, Seth kept thinking about the old man's eyes, the way they had held no fear, no theater, no performance. They had been the eyes of someone simply delivering information, like a man telling you the road ahead is washed out. Matter of fact, certain by 8:00 in the morning the trail had swallowed them. The Appalachian forest in October has a particular character unlike any other place on earth. The hardwoods, red oak, sugar maple, yellow birch had already begun to turn, so the canopy overhead was a cathedral of burning amber and deep crimson, spectacular enough to briefly arrest even Elias's relentless forward attention. The air smelled of damp earth and something older beneath it, something mineral and cold, like the deep interior of a cave. Through the morning, they made good progress. In its lower stretches, the trail was well worn, used by hunters and the occasional surveying crew. By midday, they had climbed past the familiar landmarks and into territory that Corvin's map showed only as blank contour lines. "Here," Corvin said, pulling his horse to a stop and unrolling his survey chart against the saddle horn. "This entire section from this ridge west to the creek fork, it's unregistered, 500 acres of old-growth minimum at current timber prices. I know what it's worth," Elias said. "I want to see the creek fork before we make camp. Let's move." Seth had stopped walking. He stood slightly behind his brothers, looking at a large, flat-faced boulder just off the trail. Someone, or something, had marked it not recently. The markings were deep in the stone, worn smooth by years of weather, but unmistakably deliberate, concentric circles, a series of parallel lines, and a symbol in the center that he could not name. But that made the back of his neck prickle with unease. "Elias," he said, "not now, Seth. There are markings on this rock, Cherokee, I think, like the ones in." Elias turned on his horse and fixed his youngest brother with a flat stare. "There are markings on half the rocks in these mountains. Every tribe between here and Carolina left their scratches on stone. It means nothing. Move." Seth looked at the stone one moment longer. Then he picked up the mule's rope and followed. That evening, they made camp at the base of a limestone outcropping where a shallow creek provided water and the rock face offered shelter from the wind. By any measure, it was a good camp, dry, protected, with a clear view of the trail in both directions. Elias built the fire with the efficiency of a man who had spent many nights in the field, and Corvin spread his maps across a flat stone and began making notes by firelight. Seth cooked, as he usually did, a simple meal: salt pork, dried beans, hardtack softened in the pan with a little water. He moved quietly through the preparation, listening to the sounds of the forest around them. At dusk, the forest was very loud: insects, birds settling for the night, the distant percussion of a woodpecker still working somewhere up the slope. Then, precisely at the moment the last pale light left the sky, it went silent. Not gradually, not in the natural way a forest quiets as the night deepens. All at once, as if the sound had been cut with a blade. Seth looked up from the fire. His brothers hadn't noticed. Elias was drinking from his flask, studying the northern ridge against the darkening sky. Corvin was still bent over his maps. Seth set down the pan very carefully and listened to the silence. It was not empty. That was the thing. There was something inside it, a quality of presence, dense and pressurized, like air before a lightning strike. He could feel it against his skin. He looked toward the tree line 20 feet from the camp's edge, and for one long second he saw, or thought he saw, a shape between the trunks. Tall still, not moving the way an animal moves with instinctive wariness, but standing the way a person stands when they want to be seen. Then it was gone. "Supper's ready," Seth said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. He said nothing to his brothers about what he had seen. Years ago, he had learned the cost of telling the Blackwood men about things they could not measure or own. That night, lying in his bedroll with the fire burned low and his brothers asleep, Seth stared at the canopy of stars visible through the gap in the trees above camp and listened to the silence that had never fully gone away. And just before he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, he heard it for the first time, a whisper. Not the wind, not the creek, a voice, or something performing the shape of a voice coming from the direction of the flat-faced boulder they had passed on the trail. Low, rhythmic in syllables he didn't recognize, saying something that sounded impossibly like his name. Seth woke before dawn. The fire was cold ash and pale coals. His breath made small clouds in the October air. He lay still for a moment, eyes open, cataloging the sounds of the forest returning to its daytime voice. A thrush somewhere above, the creek murmuring, wind in the upper branches. Normal, all normal. He turned his head and checked the camp. Elias was still sleeping, one arm thrown over his face. Corvin's bedroll was occupied. The mule was tied to the same tree. The horses stood at their picket, placid and undisturbed. Seth exhaled and sat up, his ached from the cold ground. With practiced hands, he rebuilt the fire and set the coffee pot over the new flames, and by the time the water was boiling, his brothers had stirred themselves awake. Over breakfast, Elias outlined the day's plan with the brisk authority of a man who had never entertained the possibility that plans could fail. They would push north to the creek fork, take measurements, mark the boundary stakes, and return to this camp by nightfall. 2 days of work at most, then down the mountain and back to Cutter's Creek in time for Elias to wire the land office in Knoxville. Clean and simple, he said, draining his coffee. The weather's changing, Corvin observed, looking north. The sky above the ridge had taken on a bruised yellowish quality that experienced mountain men knew to respect. We'll be at the fork before it turns. Elias was already striking his bedroll. Move. They moved. Through the morning, the trail climbed steeply, switchbacking up through a corridor of ancient hemlocks whose thick canopy reduced the light to a filtered, greenish dimness even at midday. With every 100 feet of elevation, the temperature dropped noticeably. The horses labored on the steeper pitches, and the mule, a typically stubborn animal, had to be coaxed and argued with at every sharp turn. It was Seth who first noticed that the trail markers had changed. Even in 1887, the Appalachian Trail system had a loose but functional network of cairns, stacked stones, placed by hunters and surveyors to indicate the route. For the first hour of climbing, the cairns had appeared regularly, reassuringly, at the bends and junctions. Then, somewhere around mid-morning, they stopped. Seth mentioned this to Corvin, who checked his compass and shrugged. We're off the maintained section, no surprise. He tapped his survey map. From here, we navigate by topography. Seth nodded and said nothing more. But an hour later, he noticed something else. Something he could not have explained to his brothers, and therefore did not try. The stones along the trail, not cairns, just the natural limestone boulders and outcroppings that studded the hillside, bore the same markings as the one he had seen the day before. Not identical exactly, but variations on the same vocabulary of symbols, concentric circles, parallel lines, that central figure his brain kept sliding away from rather than looking at directly. He recognized the pattern. These were not random occurrences of the same design. They formed a sequence, a line, as if marking a boundary or a territory. They reached the creek fork at noon, just as Elias had promised. It was a genuinely impressive piece of wilderness, 2 cold mountain streams converging in a shallow pool surrounded by massive old-growth tulip poplars, their trunks wider than a man's arms could span, their bark silvered with age. Even to Seth's untrained eye, the timber value was obvious. He understood why Corvin's ledger mind had lit up when he'd found it on the survey maps. Elias dismounted and walked the perimeter of the pool with his hands behind his back, the way he always walked when mentally converting a landscape into numbers. Corvin drove the first boundary stake with a mallet and began unwinding his measuring chain. Seth watered the horses and the mule, then sat on a rock beside the pool, watching the water. The pool was unusually still for a confluence. Both streams came in with enough force to suggest turbulence, but the pool itself was flat and dark and silent. Looking down into it, Seth found he couldn't see the bottom, though the water appeared clear. The darkness went down too deep for the pool's apparent size. He looked away. That was when he heard the second voice. Not the whisper from the night before. This was clearer, closer, and distinctly female, a low, melodic sound, half-spoken and half-sung, coming from the tree line on the far side of the pool. He stood up quickly, scanning the shadows between the trunks, a figure standing very still between 2 of the great tulip poplars. A woman, or the outline of one dressed in something dark, watching the camp with an absolute stillness no living person achieves. Elias, Seth said. What? Elias didn't look up from his survey notes. There's someone in the trees across the pool. Both brothers turned. They looked at the tree line for a long moment. I don't see anything. Corvin said. She was there. Seth stopped. The space between the trees was empty, had been empty perhaps for longer than he'd registered. Elias studied his youngest brother's face with something between irritation and concern. "You're tired, we all are. Drink some water. I know what I saw. You saw a shadow." Elias turned back to his notes. "The light does things in old growth. Everyone knows that." Corvin drove the second stake. Seth drank the water, but for the rest of the afternoon, while his brothers worked, he kept his eyes on the tree line. He had the unshakable sensation of being observed carefully, specifically, and without any of the casual indifference that animals bring to the act of watching humans in their territory. This was deliberate attention, patient, the attention of something that recognized them. That evening, they made a second camp near the creek fork, and over supper Elias was in high spirits, sketching out plans for the mill site he intended to build at the confluence. He spoke with expansive enthusiasm about the Blackwood name, how their father had built the family's first mill from nothing, how he himself had tripled the operation, and how this timber tract would double it again. "Father used to say the Blackwood name would last 1,000 years in this county," he said. "Father also said the land in the lower valley was bottomland." Corvin replied dryly, "It flooded every other spring." Elias laughed, genuinely pleased. In the field he was a different man, less rigid, more alive. Seth almost liked him in these moments. Almost that night Seth lay awake again. This time he didn't wait for sleep. He lay on his back, stared at the stars, and listened with focused attention to everything beyond the camp's perimeter. The silence came again at precisely the same moment, the instant the last light fully left the sky. That same pressurized, inhabited quiet. Then, from the direction of the pool, very faintly, the sound of water disturbed not by the incoming streams. Something else, something that moved through the pool's dark water slowly, without urgency. Seth closed his eyes and did not open them again until morning. When morning came, he looked across the camp and felt the wrongness before his mind had fully assembled what his eyes were telling him. Elias's bedroll was empty, his boots were still on the ground beside it. His jacket was folded neatly across his pack, as though he had set it down with care before stepping out for a moment. Corvin was awake, sitting up, staring at the empty bedroll with an expression Seth had never seen on his brother's face. Fear. "How long?" Seth asked. "I don't know," Corvin said very quietly, clearing his throat. "I woke up and he was already gone." They called Elias's name until their voices were raw. For 2 hours, they searched the camp's perimeter in expanding circles. They found no footprints leaving the camp, not in the creek bank's soft mud, not in the frost-hardened earth at the tree line. The boundary stakes were still in the ground. Corvin's measuring chain was coiled beside his pack. Only Elias was gone, vanished as completely as if the mountain had simply drawn him in. They had to go down. That was the only rational thought Corvin could hold on to, and he repeated it to himself like a prayer as he broke camp with shaking hands. We go down and get help and come back with more men. We can't leave without him," Seth said. "We can't find him alone." Corvin's voice was precise, controlled, the voice he used when preventing himself from screaming. "2 men cannot search 500 acres of old growth. We go down, we get the county sheriff, we come back with dogs." Seth looked at the tree line. "Do you believe that will work?" Corvin threw his pack onto the mule's back and didn't answer. They set out on the trail at 8:00 in the morning, descending south. The sky had fulfilled its bruised promise from the day before and delivered a low, heavy overcast that pressed down on the mountain like a lid. The temperature had dropped further. Their breath came in visible puffs. For the first hour, the descent was normal, steep and demanding, but recognizable, following the switchbacks they had climbed 2 days prior. Then Corvin stopped. He was staring at a flat-faced boulder beside the trail. Seth came up beside him and looked. The markings were the same symbols they had been seeing for 2 days. But there was something else cut into the stone surface above the older marks, something recent, within the last day perhaps, scratched urgently into the rock with what appeared to be a knife point. A single word, *back. That's Elias's knife work, Corvin said very quietly. He had seen his brother carve his initials into wood and stone 100 times. The style was unmistakable. He was here, he passed this rock. Going which direction? Seth asked. Corvin studied the positioning of the word, the angle of the scratch marks. Down. He was going down when he wrote this. Then he reached the trail. He was on his way down and something. Let's move, Corvin said. They moved faster now. But the trail was doing something Corvin's rational mind kept refusing to accept. After the marked boulder, the path descended for another 40 minutes, a perfectly normal, recognizable descent. Then it leveled. Then it began to climb. Corvin stopped and checked his compass. South. They were still heading south. The compass was clear and steady. He checked the topography against his map. The terrain ahead should be descending. His eyes told him it was ascending. This isn't possible, he said aloud. I know, Seth said. He didn't sound surprised. A compass error. The iron content in the limestone can. Corvin. Seth put a hand on his brother's arm. We have been walking south for 2 hours, and we are higher on this mountain than when we started. You know that. Stop explaining it. Corvin looked at his map for a long time. Then he folded it very precisely and put it back in his coat. All right, he said. What do we do? It was the first time in Seth's memory that Corvin had ever asked him that question. He felt the weight of it. We stopped trying to go down, Seth said. Every time we try to leave directly, the trail bends back. He stopped, thought carefully. I think we need to find what it wants first. What it wants, Corvin repeated with only a ghost of his usual skepticism. The thing that took Elias, whatever is keeping us here. Seth looked up at the mountain, his jaw set. I don't think we're meant to leave before it's finished with us. That is an insane thing to say. Yes, Seth agreed. It is, and it's also true. Where do you feel pulled toward right now? Not where you think you should go. Where does something pull you? Corvin stood in the silence of the mountain for a long moment. His eyes moved, despite himself, northeast toward the deep timber above the creek fork. There, he said, almost inaudibly. Then that's where we go, said Seth, and he started walking. Within minutes, the northeast timber closed over them, old growth so dense that the light dropped to a permanent gray twilight regardless of the hour. The ground here was soft with centuries of accumulated leaf matter, silent under their boots. The trees were enormous, their trunks colonized by moss and fern, their roots arching out of the ground like the backs of submerged creatures. They had been walking for perhaps 30 minutes when they came to the clearing. It was not on Corvin's maps. It could not have been. It was the kind of space maps don't capture. A roughly circular opening in the old growth, perhaps 60 feet across, with a single massive granite boulder at its center. The boulder was perhaps 10 feet high, flat on top, its surface covered entirely in the same symbols they had been seeing since the first day on the trail. But here, the symbols were older and deeper and more numerous, covering every inch of the granite in a dense, overlapping language of signs. And they were not merely decorative. There was a logic to them, an order, a progression from the base of the stone to its summit, that suggested to Seth's watching eyes something like a contract. An inscription of terms. At the base of the boulder, arranged in a precise semicircle, were 12 stones of roughly equal size, each carved with a single symbol. And in the center of the semicircle, sitting on the ground with his knees drawn up and his back against the granite, was Elias Blackwood. He was alive, his eyes were open. He was staring at a point in the middle distance with an expression of absolute, unblinking attention. Elias, Corvin ran forward and grabbed his brother by the shoulders. Elias turned his head with the slow deliberateness of a man surfacing from deep water. He looked at Corvin, then at Seth. His eyes were clear, but altered the particular blankness of a man who has looked at something that has permanently reorganized his interior geography. It showed me everything, he said. His voice was normal, calm. Grandfather's deal, what he gave them, what he took. A long pause. What we owe. Can you stand? Seth asked. Elias looked at his boots as if he'd forgotten he had feet. He pressed his palms against the boulder and stood slowly. He appeared physically unharmed. "We have to go," Corvin said. Asterisk now asterisk, "We're going down this mountain right now." Elias nodded. "It won't stop us now. It just needed one of us to know." "To know asterisk what asterisk?" Corvin demanded. But Elias only looked at the symbols on the boulder for one more long moment, then turned south and walked. They descended through the afternoon. The trail cooperated now, descending as a trail should, carrying them south and downward without the impossible folding of the previous morning. The oppressive overcast remained, and the forest held its peculiar inhabited silence. But the active malevolence Seth had felt in every tree and stone for the past 2 days had diminished. Something more like a watchful neutrality, as if a jury had heard its evidence and was now deliberating. Elias walked in front, steady and quiet. He had said almost nothing since rising from the base of the boulder. When Corvin tried to press him for details, Elias shook his head once and kept walking. It was at the 3rd-mile marker, a surviving cairn from the lower trail, that Seth noticed the light beginning to fail. "We're not going to make the trailhead before dark," he said. Corvin checked his pocket watch. "We have 2 hours of light. We can." "No," Elias said. He had stopped walking. He was looking at the western sky, where the overcast had taken on a deep, bruised violet. "We make camp here. We do not walk in the dark. Not tonight." It was the first time in Seth's life he had heard Elias defer to the mountain. He said nothing and began gathering wood. They camped in a flat area just off the trail, sheltered by a stand of Virginia pine. The fire was good, the food simple, and nobody talked much unusual for the 3 of them. Even Corvin, who processed the world through the machinery of his own voice, was quiet. Finally, over coffee, Elias spoke. He told them about their grandfather, Jacob Blackwood, who had come to these mountains in 1841 with a land claim written by a judge who had been paid in whiskey and timber rights. The Cherokee clans whose ancestral territory covered the area the Aniun-Wea, the principal people, had been largely displaced by the forced removal of 1838. But a remnant community had remained in the deep backcountry of the Appalachians, precisely in the territory Jacob had claimed. Jacob had not simply occupied the land. He had driven the remnant out with violence, dogs, fire, threats that went beyond threats. 3 elders had died in the process: an old man, a woman, and a child. The eldest of the displaced elders, before he died, had laid a specific and formal curse on the Blackwood bloodline. Not in anger. That was the detail that had apparently affected Elias most deeply. Sitting in the dark at the base of the granite boulder, while whatever lived in these mountains showed him the past like a lantern, slide show. It had been done calmly, deliberately, as a matter of accounting. The Blackwood blood had taken something. The mountain would take the Blackwood blood in return, not all at once, over generations, methodically. 3, Elias said. He was staring at the fire. 3 elders. The debt is 3 Blackwoods, 1 for each life taken. Corvin was very still. "And we are 3 brothers." "Yes." The fire popped. An ember rolled onto the stone hearth they had built and slowly died. "The thing in the clearing," Seth said carefully, "it held you there. Why let you go?" "Because it needs us to understand first." Elias finally looked up from the fire. His eyes moved to each of his brothers in turn. "It doesn't just want our bodies. It wants our names to know what they owe. It wants the accounting to be understood before it's completed." "There has to be a way to end it," Seth said. "Every curse has a breaking point," Corvin said quietly. He was staring at the fire with the focused look he got when working a complex sum. "There must be a condition." "There is," Elias said. The elder who laid the curse included the terms. "The debt can be discharged, not reversed, not undone, but settled. If a Blackwood willingly returns to the mountain what was taken, not money, not timber rights, the land itself, filed, recorded, irrevocable. The Creek Fork tract," Seth said, "and the lower valley sections, everything Jacob originally claimed from them, all of it deeded back to whatever tribal authority can receive it." Corvin absorbed this for a long moment. That's the entire foundation of the Blackwood timber operation, Father's life work, our inheritance. I know what it is, Elias said. If we sign it over, all of it, the curse is settled, that's what it showed me. Another long silence. The fire shifted and resettled. And if we don't, Seth asked. Elias looked at him steadily. Then the mountain finishes its arithmetic. 3 debts, 1 paid in advance before we were born. The other 2, he stopped. The other 2 are us. Corvin finished. His voice was very flat. Yes, Seth looked at the fire. He thought about the boots on the ground beside Elias's empty bedroll, the folded jacket, the care with which those objects had been arranged, as if their owner had set them down with intention. Preparing for a different kind of travel, he thought about the shape he had seen between the trees on the first evening. The voice in the pool's darkness, the silence that came at the precise moment the last light left the sky. He thought about Hector Crow's eyes in the saloon in Cutter's Creek. The stones have a long memory, Mr. Blackwood, and your family's debt to those stones is older than you know. I'll sign, Seth said. Corvin looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Elias, then he looked at the mountain. So will I, he said. Elias exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to release something more than just air. Then, we go down in the morning, he said, and we make this right. The fire burned low. The forest settled into its night sounds, slow and measured. And somewhere above them on the high ridge, the wind moved through the old-growth timber with a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost like a sigh of acknowledgement. They reached Cutter's Creek on the morning of October 9th, 1887. The horses were gaunt from the hard days in the field, and the brothers themselves looked as men look when they have passed through something that resists easy description, not physically damaged, but altered in a way that sat behind their eyes and made people look twice at them in the street. Hector Crow was sitting on the porch of the saloon when they rode past. He watched them with his pale winter sky eyes, and he did not ask where they had been or what had happened. He simply gave a single slow nod as Elias Blackwood met his gaze. Elias nodded back. It took 11 days to complete the legal work. It was complicated by the fact that formal tribal land title in Tennessee in 1887 was a bureaucratic labyrinth. The forced displacement of the Cherokee had left the legal landscape as fractured and uncertain as the physical one. Corvin, whose skills with documentation and legal process were as sharp as any lawyer's, drove the process with the same focused intensity he had always brought to expanding the family's holdings, except now, running in the opposite direction. He found a Cherokee representative named Thomas Walking Stick, a former interpreter who had worked with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and understood the machinery of land title better than any white attorney in the county. Walking Stick was a careful, dignified man who had heard many claims from many directions and had learned to evaluate them all with patient skepticism. He listened to what Corvin laid out the full scope of the Blackwood holdings, the original Jacob Blackwood claim of 1,841, the documented violence of the displacement, and was silent for a long time. Why? He asked finally. Simply that. Corvin opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. Because the rational answer the mountain will kill us if we don't was not only inadequate, but, in this man's presence, felt obscenely small. He glanced at Seth. Seth looked at Walking Stick directly. Because it is owed, he said. Because what was taken cannot be untaken, but it can be returned. And because 3 men died so that our family could profit, and that debt has never been acknowledged. Walking Stick studied him for a long time. 3, he said. Yes, Seth said. 3. Something shifted in the older man's face, not surprise. Recognition. He nodded once and picked up his pen. The deed transfer was filed on October 20th, 1887, in the land office in Knoxville. 640 acres, including the Creek Fork tract, the old-growth timber holdings, and the lower valley sections. Transferred in perpetuity, irrevocable. Every notarization Corvin could think to obtain obtained. every legal redundancy available applied. The Blackwood timber operation, stripped of its original foundation, retrenched to its remaining properties. Elias sold the mill within the year and moved east to Chattanooga, where he built a modest hardware business that never made him wealthy, but that he ran with a quiet conscientiousness his former associates found puzzling and his new ones found admirable. He never returned to the Appalachian backcountry. Corvin kept the ledgers. He always kept the ledgers. Over the following decade, with the same meticulous precision he had applied to the timber surveys, he documented the full history of Jacob Blackwood's land claim, the payments, the violence, names of the displaced. He gave the completed record to Walking Sticks organization without ceremony. He asked for no acknowledgement. He received none and was at peace with that. Seth went back once, 6 months after the deed was filed, in the early spring of 1888, when the Appalachian forest was just beginning to push its first green through the accumulated debris of winter. He hiked the trail alone, carrying nothing but a pack with 3 days' supplies, and the small, unreasonable conviction that there was something he needed to see. He reached the clearing on the second day. The granite boulder was the same. The ancient symbols covered its surface with the same dense, layered complexity. The 12 carved stones still stood in their semicircle at its base, but the atmosphere of the place was different. The pressurized quality, the inhabited weight that had saturated every inch of air on the October journey. It was gone. The clearing was simply a clearing, old and quiet and full of the ordinary holy silence of deep forest, but no longer coiled with intent. The jury had reached its verdict, filed its finding, and adjourned. Seth stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. He was not sure what he had expected to feel: relief, perhaps, or resolution. What he actually felt was smaller and more honest than either of those, a kind of grief. Not for the Blackwood holdings, not for the inheritance that had been surrendered, but for the 3 elders who had died, and for the generations of consequence their deaths had set in motion. For the cost paid forward across time of violence that had seemed, in its moment, like simple commerce. The wind moved through the tulip poplars at the clearing's edge. He thought he heard in it something that was not quite a voice, but was not quite not a voice either. A frequency, a tone. It did not say his name. It did not threaten or confirm or conclude. It simply acknowledged that he was there. He nodded at the stone, picked up his pack, and walked back down the mountain. Epilogue. The land at the creek fork remained undeveloped for decades. When the first federal wilderness protection legislation reached Tennessee in the mid-20th century, a significant portion of the original Blackwood transfer was included in the protected boundary preserved by the grinding accident of bureaucratic history from the timber operations that had consumed everything around it. Old-growth tulip poplars still stand at the confluence of the 2 streams. Their trunks are wider than a man's arms can span. Their bark is silvered with age. Hector Crow died in Cutter's Creek in the winter of 1888 at a documented age of 74. His obituary in the county paper noted that he was a lifelong resident of the area and that he had no known family. Thomas Walking Sticks' documentation eventually became part of a larger historical record held by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The Blackwood name appears in that record once, in a section concerning the restoration of unlawfully claimed lands. It appears without comment, just the name and the date and the acreage, which is, in the end, exactly enough. The mountain remembers, the mountain waits, and sometimes rarely, but sometimes the mountain accepts what is owed and lets the living go. End.